Good evening, everybody. I've been really looking forward to this discussion about Helen Garner's nonfiction, as is evidenced actually by how many emails have been going around talking about her work to prepare for this. My name's Sophie Cunningham. I normally chair these events, but tonight I'm a panellist as well, and I'll say a bit more about why I'm sort of more involved than usual later on. And I would like to introduce our co-speakers. Bernadette Brennan, who's an academic and researcher in contemporary Australian writing, literature and ethics. She's the author of a number of publications, including a monograph on Brian Castro, 2 edited collections, Just Words and Ethical Investigation, and of course the recent book about Helen Garner, which the name has tragically escaped me.
A Writing Life. Helen Garner and her work.
Which is it's a wonderful book, and I commend it to you. It's also on sale tonight. And then on my far left is Chloe Hooper, whose first novel was a child's book of true crime, which was shortlisted for many awards and was a New York Times notable book. The Tall Man, her non-fiction account of the death in custody of Cameron Domagee, won many literary awards, and Chloe's latest novel is The Engagement, which was published in 2012. Actually, and this also, before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge that we're speaking today on the lands of the Kulin Nation, and I welcome give thanks to our elders past, present and future. Before I go any further, I don't know if Helen's watching tonight or not. I was sort of hoping she wouldn't, but but just in case you are, Helen, I wondered if we could. I don't normally do the warm-up thing, but if people would be prepared to yell out "Happy Birthday, Helen!" It was her 75th birthday, so if we could just yell out "Happy Birthday, Helen!"
Happy Birthday, Helen!
That way we should find out whether she was watching or not. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to do that is because we're all here, I think, as huge admirers of Helen's work, but I also think that it's really important that all good writers deserve a critical look. So we're not just here to kind of say Helen is fabulous. I think we're here to have a really nut out our feelings about her work. And I know that Helen said on the ABC yesterday, everywhere we go, we just seem to be surrounded by bullshit, clouds and vapours of bullshit. Some days you just feel you're going to choke on it, you can't breathe. In order to blast through the bullshit cloud, you've got to be a bit brutal, I think. And she then recalled an American critic who referred to her work as ruthless in the way I like best, and she thought, I'll take that as a compliment. Because there is a bit of a trend, I think I see it in writers' festivals and not just writers' festivals, see it with artists and writers where once people become iconographic, as I think we can agree Helen has become, it becomes really hard to discuss their work. But what's really interesting about Helen is how fully engaged she's been in our cultural life for so many decades, and that it's because she's very vibrant and engaged, I think it's really important that we do, not that I've got anything particularly to say, but in a critical sense, but we're here to kind of pay respect to her work rather than just adore it, I think. I also just wanted to let you know that she'll be in conversation with Richard Feidler on November the 23rd, so that's, and if you're interested in her work, another time to catch up on her. My name is Sophie Cunningham. I was an editor for many years and a publisher with McFee Penguin, which is when I got, actually I first met Helen when I was 18, when she came to speak to me at Monash University where I was studying. I was extremely influenced by Monkey Grip and all of Helen's fiction and much of her non-fiction. I edited Cosmo Cosmolino, I did production on various editions of her work when I was working at McFee Gribble. I was in fact briefly her publisher when I was publisher at McFee Penguin, though as Bernadette's book makes clear, her main editorial relationship for many years, if not decades, was Hilary McPhee. And in spirit of full disclosure, I also briefly went out with her second husband at some point. But that was, she wrote the film script Last Days of Chez Nous about that particular relationship. So I have a long history with her, and the reason I even mention that is because it's sort of an interesting, the boundary between the personal, the fiction and non-fiction is so interesting in her work, and it's one of the things I know that Bernadette writes about, and it was quite interesting for me to sometimes see little bits of myself on the page, and how disconcerting that can be. So I've talked a little bit about her impact on me, and I really, before we talked in too much detail, I wanted Bernadette and Chloe both to kind of just talk generally about what Helen's work has meant to them over the years, because I think none of us probably have a static response. I mean, certainly my relationship to her work's always evolving.
Okay, well, I first came across Helen's work, I think, as an undergraduate, and I enjoyed her work. I wrote essays on her work. When I became an academic at the University of Sydney, I taught her work for 12 years, I think. I taught Helen's work, and that was very interesting teaching that when we're talking about these essays, because the first ones I was teaching were the entries in My Hard Heart. And back in the day, so I'm talking 10, 12 years ago, there was a generational response to those essays, and the younger students were sort of, oh yeah, whatever, you know, this is pretty old. People older than sort of 35 were just, oh, Helen Garner, I love this. And what I've seen over the last decade is that has changed, and that the younger students are as engaged as the older ones, which I find really interesting.
Because I'm 53, because I actually think our age is relevant in terms of how we first related.
I'm 55.
You can just say ish.
No, I'm 44.
She's a baby.
Yes.
We'll forgive you. So my work then, I was just teaching Helen's work, and then obviously I've now written a book on Helen's work because I decided that it was time that somebody wrote a book when there'd been 40 years worth of publishing. And there was no definitive book on Helen Garner's life and work. So Helen gave me access to her archives at the National Library, and so for 18 months I worked pretty intensely on those archives, on Helen's work and with Helen, and wrote this book. So my relationship is not static at all. It's changed quite dramatically.
Chloe.
Well, I feel as though the influence that Helen's had on my writing is sort of incalculable. And it's been such a pleasure rereading these essays, because I just think that she's so good. They're so good. I know Helen slightly socially because she's been very generous to me. But I think that my relationship with her work is really as a writer and a reader. I don't have the sort of, social associations on the page. I don't think I'd recognise anybody, so I'm really just reading it for the words. I came of age during the first Stone saga, and I was on campus when that, at Melbourne Uni, when that book came out, and
Were you at Ormond?
No, I wasn't at Ormond, but I had friends that were at Ormond, and so that was a sort of, that was such a politicised book, and we were ferociously in disagreement with it. And I guess it's interesting in the sort of talking about that book after the sort of Hollywood revelations of the last month. I think that in the 25 years since it was published, our attitude towards harassment has shifted a great deal. So I guess I sort of disagree with some of Helen's arguments in that book. I'd like to go back and reread it though, because I think that she can put herself on the line and turn a sentence and examine situations with such skill and poetry that I'm sure it's definitely worth rereading.
I think it was Karen Goldsworthy who said at some point that one of the things about Helen's work is that people have a very passionate response to it, and that's actually what I find, that even when I disagree, you still remain very engaged and interested because she's so, partly because you want to agree because she's such a good writer, or I find myself wanting to agree with her, and The First Stone is certainly a book that threw up those complicated questions. Chloe, I've asked each of us to just talk a little bit about our responses to the particular essays that we're talking about tonight, and I asked Chloe to talk a little bit about Killing Daniel. So do you mind just talking about that?
Sure. One of the things that strikes me about this essay is how contemporary it feels. I mean, there are some sort of moments that time stamp it, and as usual, her eye for detail is unparalleled. So the accused man in the dock, his thin tie, and he's got a mullet. But otherwise, you feel like you could be going down to the Supreme Court, and you could sort of walk in, and this would be happening, now. I think it starts with the classic no bullshit Garner entry point. What sort of a man would beat a 2-year-old boy to death? And you sort of have to you recoil slightly and then have to commit to reading this and to following her into a subject matter that's difficult, and she takes you to places where you don't want to look, and where a lot of writers don't want to look. I first read this when I was 20, and it's more. I found it more difficult reading this with small children. I've spent a lot of my last sort of 5 or 6 years with children who are 2-year-olds, and the daily exercise of getting them in and out of their pyjamas, the little arms through the sleeves and the legs through the trouser holes, and the physicality of raising small children, their fleshiness. It's just such a physical, corporeal business, and so to think about the injuries that this child suffered is very traumatic.
Yeah, I actually was, I'm sorry I asked you to, I thought about that after I asked you to talk about it,
No.
because it's quite a painful, I found it really hard to reread.
It is hard to read, but the thing, I mean, this is the sort of brilliance of her, and I know this wasn't meant to be a sort of pissing in your pocket session, but I'm afraid I'm falling into that trap, is that it's a sort of, she makes it so beautiful in some strange way. I mean, it's a sort of pointillist or impressionistic piece, and she asks this question at the beginning, and she doesn't entirely answer it. I mean, it really is a sketch of what she sees, that she makes it look very effortless. And then she goes on to ask, to really at the end of it, bring it around to ask us, what happened to Daniel Valerio reflects on us all, on our private and public natures. And then she's asked the question of the man who, what sort of a man could do this, and then she really implicates, I think, the number of social connections that this child's family had, and the doctors and the teachers who all saw this and looked the other way. And then she implicates everybody in this failure, and I think she then sort of makes a plea, which is interesting too, for you to follow her and to justify in a way this looking in at places people don't want to look. The idea that despite all our enlightenment and our social engineering and our safety nets, there's something that only philosophy, religion or art can handle, the worm in the heart of the rose. And I think that there's a struggle in her writing often with what she's doing, and that this is what she tries to do, is
It's why that piece is so great, really, isn't it? Because it would be too much, it would almost be too pervy to just detail what happened to the boy, but to kind of make you feel that keenly and then connect it to the wider social fabric is what makes it a kind of brilliant essay, I think.
Which is what she does then with all her
Non-fiction.
her two later crime non-fiction, which says to all of us, I've taken you to that dark space where you didn't want to go, and I've taken you very carefully, and I've looked after you to a certain extent, but I've pushed you to the darkness. And at the end of that, I'm going to say, and it's all of our responsibility.
Was that nominated? It was certainly nominated for a Walkley.
It won the Walkley.
It won the Walkley. And it was also, I remember, it was the first time I became really aware of her non-fiction work becoming more journalistic, even though she had worked as a journalist before. That it was sort of that she was engaging with crime and those kind of things rather than writing these more personal.
It's also
stories.
incredibly important, since you started talking about the first stone, that was in September '92, I think it was. So she took that job with Time magazine, and that's while she was researching the first stone. Well, the first stone episodes were happening. And so she then, and that's the argument she makes in the first stone, which gets a lot of people very angry, and she says in that particular essay, this is not about, violence against women, as she's saying in the first stone, because if you want to see real violence, you see this, of what's happened with killing Daniel. I think it's not an accident that she is covering that trial while she's hearing the other judgments of the women's officer at the university, and thinking there's got to be a gradation. And then when she does True Stories and puts it out, she makes sure that this essay, Killing Daniel, comes just before the fate of the first stone.
Yes,
So
I noticed that, and I was.
She's talking about violence and gradations of violence.
Does she compare them in the first stone? I haven't really read the first stone. And like Chloe, I'm sort of keen to.
In the first stone, she just does say, yes, she says, this is real violence against. This is. She says there's always this slide from harassment into violence. That's her take, and she says, I refuse to allow that to happen. I have to name this and use the language of what I see. And I think she was influenced by this. The Paul Ayton and the Killing Daniel.
Yes, I actually, when what the point Chloe made about the Harvey Weinstein, the talk around harassment that's happening at the moment, in a way, is interesting, because I think that in the first stone, part of people's frustration was that she wasn't hugely interested in exploring the way that lesser crimes lead to greater crimes.
Yes, yeah.
And that kind of link, which is what's getting focused on. She wasn't alone in that, by the most of society didn't really look at it. That abusing your partners, hurting animals, all those things, like very much kind of like practice, for want of a better word, for people who are kind of become much worse. Which is one of the reasons why harassment is, such an important topic. I was going to ask you to talk about side too deep for words, but I actually think it might make more sense in terms of the logic of the panel to just talk briefly about the essay, which I was going to talk about, which is The Art of the Dumb Question, which is where she talks very much about her early professional life, her early writing life is what I mean by professional life. And it's a fantastic, it's a wonderful little autobiographical piece, actually, if you're interested in knowing the history of her work, and her description of linking losing her job as a high school teacher with her kind of, and her discovery that her diaries had certain rhythms and patterns that became interesting to her, and then her desire to pull those together into something that she wasn't even necessarily thinking of as a novel, is just a really lovely explanation in a way of how she came to be a writer. She's actually an extraordinarily articulate person when it comes to describing her work, what it is she's trying to do, and that's one of the things I've always really valued about her as a writing teacher. I use her work all the time because she's so extremely good at that. But in this essay, she also raises a question, which I'm just going to leave hanging rather than trying to answer, but I think it's at the nub of a lot of the kind of complicated reactions people can have for her work regarding both her fiction and her non-fiction. She says in this essay, the question of writers' use of real events and people in their books is not new. It has always caused vexation and it always will. It's the nature of a writer to exhibit what Nadine Gordimer calls a monstrous detachment. Right, and I know that detachment was commented on a lot actually when people were writing about responding to House of Grief. People were frustrated with her capacity for this detachment. Writers, she says in the introduction to her stories, have powers of observation heightened beyond the normal. The tension between standing apart and being fully involved. That is what makes a writer. I used to think that if I examined my motivation as ruthlessly as I could, I would be able to do better than just write fiction, which was a settling of accounts with people. I thought I'd be ethically in the clear as long as I wrote in good faith. That is, if I laid myself on the line as well, applied myself the same degree of analysis and revelation that I did to the other people concerned. I still happen to think this attitude is legitimate as far as it goes, but it's based on an assumption of consciousness in the novelist, which is over-optimistic to the point of being grandiose. I really like that paragraph, partly because she just lays on the table the ethical issues, and I've always taken issue actually with her on her sense that if she lays herself bare, it's okay to lay other people bare, because she actually, it's easier to give permission to lay yourself bare. I mean, people aren't necessarily quite sure what it is they're agreeing to or whether they've even agreed to it, and I think the contract is not necessarily always clear, not just between Helen and her subjects, between any writer and their subjects, but there's certainly an element of understanding of the complexity of all that in the paragraph. And in general, she's become increasingly self-aware, but even early on was starting to really nut out these complicated issues. But one of the other things that Australians aren't very good at talking about, I think, is religion, and she is a religious person, and so I mean, another writer I worked with many years ago was Tim Winton. And she talks a lot about her relationship with Tim Winton, and he is very religious, and I'm really aware that doesn't get talked about in terms of how people respond to their work, which I find interesting because people are happy to talk about feminism or various other kind of issues to do with what ideologies that may or may not guide her, but we're really shy about talking about people's relationship with God or with their own God. So Bernadette, you talk a bit about that. You talk quite a lot about that in your writing life. But that's why I asked you to talk about Sighs Too Deep for Words, where she talks a bit about her coming to Christianity as an adult.
Yeah, I think that's a really important essay to think about in terms of the wider knowledge of Helen and her work. An anecdote to start with, when I'd read Vivian Gornick's The Odd Woman in the City, there was a phrase in it that I loved and I wanted to use as an epigraph for one of my chapters. And I sent Helen a text and said, hey, have you read this latest one? She said, no, I haven't read that one, but I adored Fierce Attachments. And I said, oh, it's just perfect. It matches exactly what I'm trying to say about you with your Everywhere I Look essays. And about 10 minutes later, she sends one back and says, hey, but by the way, Vivian Gornick's, the big difference is she's an atheist and I'm not. And by this stage, I've been working on her work for a year and a bit. It's like, yeah, hello, I know this. But it's interesting the number of people who didn't appreciate the importance of Helen's spirituality to her, and I think that's why it's really important for us to pick this essay and to talk about it tonight. So she's said many times in publications and in interviews that she has a sense that she doesn't believe in the afterlife. She doesn't believe that Jesus as such is a real person or whatever, but she says, I believe in love, in the spirit, in energy. She believes very firmly in communion, and that's what you get in this particular essay. But what I find really interesting about that is what she loves about communion, and I could read the bit out, but we probably haven't got that much time. where she says you're an ordinary person with other ordinary people, and you come together and formally you say, basically, I've stuffed up, and formally you get forgiven, and formally you come together and you are fed and nourished. And if you think about that, way back, what's the beginning of Monkey Grip? Starts with them having bacon in the morning, and then it's the tables. If you think of Cosmo Cosmolino, the everyday meal is a sacramental meal. This idea of having people to your table and nourishing each other and being nourished. And so...
When was this essay written? So when did she start becoming explicitly religious?
Well, this was published in Feel of Steel, which is 2000. It was written in 2001. So 2001, she's recovering. She's getting over the breakdown of her marriage to Murray Bale at the end of 1998. She's moved back to Melbourne. She's sort of putting herself back together. Her mother's dying, or has just died, and she's trying to write about what she needs. The best, and I'll come back to that, to when did she get, I mean, she got baptised in 1962, so it's been a long history of in and out of understanding her own spirituality and writing about it. But what is really interesting, and maybe you might have seen this when you read this essay, is it's characteristic Garner in that it's fragmentary. So she gives you moments and she lets you join the dots, she lets you follow with her, and it builds and it builds and it builds, and it starts off quite gently. It's the usual self-deprecating thing. Oh, I'm not clever enough to read the Bible, and yes, I did read 3 of them, but I didn't really read it. And then we get to, but isn't it magnificent? And isn't there an energy with these stories? And there's the angel just standing in the doorway, and he's followed by a dog, and yes, she gives you these sentences.
The eye for detail too.
Yeah, the eye for detail that she's picked out. Oh, by the way, I can't read the Bible very well, but did you notice this sentence and this sentence and this sentence and this sentence? And then there's the, oh, this is thrilling, this is absolutely fantastic, but this is also shattering. The force and the physicality of this. And she takes you through, then she explains why she enjoys going to service, the ritual, the explication of the Gospels, the minister. At this point, she's at the parish at Darlinghurst with Bill Lawton, who she respects enormously. And then we start to get to the nub of that essay, I think, which is the water at the well, the woman who's the sinner, who's chosen by Jesus. We then get the prodigal daughter, and we then get the quote from the Apocrypha about the father saying, all I wish on you is a blessing, is goodness in your life. And you think, this essay starts off, oh, I'm really hopeless on this, and then we fragment all the way along until we get to the absolute nub of, I want that blessing from my father. So it's just a beautiful, beautiful essay.
It does raise, what you've said raises a couple of things that make me sometimes struggle with her work. One is that self-deprecation. I don't think it's disingenuous. I mean, I think it's genuine. And I get distressed when women always put themselves down as a way of better making people be more responsive to the power of their work, and I sometimes feel...
It does seem to be, to me, like quite a common Australian trope that you see in, not just in sort of women's writing. Right. Don't you think that there's,
Women
there's a sort
more
of...
than men. Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure. But continue.
Certainly, in fact, in the Art of the Dumb Question, she talks about how any dingbat could get a job as a teacher, and I was hopeless at university and those kind of things. So she certainly, regardless of how gendered it is, puts herself down a lot, which I think can be a way of not owning the power of language and her impact on the culture. She actually says that in a later essay. I'm trying to remember one that she came to realise. Not about this.
When she says she can't sign her name anymore because
it's...
Yes, it's actually called The Art of the Dumb Question after the first stone or something. It's the same title, but it has a different...
but the other thing is the need for the approval of the father, which is such a powerful strand in so much of her non-fiction. It obviously informs, I think, the first stone, the Joe Chinquay's Consolation, and I think she went into House of Grief with some similar sentiments, even though I think that book's more complicated in that I think a lot of her work, sometimes she goes in with quite a strong view, and while she builds a real complexity around all the questions, her essential view may not change. In House of Grief, I felt that her point of view actually changed, or she in fact writes about the fact that she changed her mind during the trial, but nonetheless I still think she works extremely hard to understand male motivation and is less generous with women, and it's not just actually something I feel on the first stone.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And I think she genuinely, I think she likes all people, but I think she does try very hard to sympathise with the male characters more than the female character, except maybe not. Maybe there's that sort of female friendship back in Monkey Grip, which is, I think, moderately intense, I would say. And then maybe it starts to be more fragmented once we get to Honour and Other People's Children. So we have the great relationship between Kathleen and Jenny in Honour, but then you see in Other People's Children the fracturing, which was the fracturing that she actually did experience in her share household between herself and another woman.
Do you think, I'm going to just, be a, sort of throw this in. Do you think she gets a harder time, or that she is sometimes judged more harshly as a writer because she is a woman?
I certainly think that...
These sorts of the lines of...
I think that calling her work, particularly say with Monkey Grip, absolutely, they kind of focus on, it's basically a diary, whereas a lot of first novels have a certain quality, and I think that in general with female writers there's a more fixation on the autobiographical kind of motivation behind the work. I think Helen is interested in that and engages with it in a way that can sometimes fuel people who want to condemn her for that, by being honest. I mean, when I was editing, I worked with young men who clearly had written explicitly autobiographical novels, but when they were asked if it was autobiographical, they just say, nah. As a way of deflecting questions, and good, I don't criticise them for that either. It just meant that they were better at shutting it down, whereas Helen is very polite and serious, and so tries to be honest in her answers, which I think sometimes she's been punished for.
But also that might be a great cause for delight for a lot of readers. I imagine there's readers here who, like myself, would read something of Helen's and go, oh yes, I know that feeling, I know that situation, I know you've caught it exactly. And she knows it from her own life, she's written it so brilliantly, and it speaks to all of us with our lives.
Yes, so, no, I think it's one of the reasons why people love her work, and it's one of the reasons why I love her work. And I think the spare room seemed to really throw people into a spin, because she actually calls the main character Helen, which was a really kind of I thought she was sort of taunting people, really, readers, with that very question, Chloe, about whether or not it's fiction or non-fiction, whether she's based it on her own life or not.
I just want to say that there is an amazing description, just because we're talking about these essays, in Sighs Too Deep for Words, of shame, which, I mean, I don't think you can write like she does and then not feel a type of, that you've exposed yourself. And
read it, it's so beautiful.
It's just this, I thought no one who could, I don't know if I've read a better description, but even now there are days as I go about my business along certain streets where my past cruelties, my foolishness, my harsh egotisms hang around me like a fog, or rather when they haunt me like a pack of cards which offer themselves to my consciousness one by one and with a clever appropriateness, as if a tormentor's mind were actively choosing and shuffling them so that their juxtapositions are forever fresh, always bright, and with a honed, unbearable edge.
Extraordinary. And then she moves on to this idea of being washed clean, and a sort of a baptism or a forgiveness and a salvation in that kind of way.
I suppose I agree that she, in some of those, Josephine Quest Constellation and The First Stone, she does sometimes let the male characters off more lightly, but I just wonder whether or not she also gets sort of dissected, and whether we do
true.
this to her writing from as readers in a way that continues this pattern.
When you were reading, talking about killing Daniel, in fact, something, and this is one of the things I love because my response to her work is constantly changing. So Joe Cinque's Consolation is a book that I don't like, but I liked it a lot more after reading Bernadette's book. And actually hearing you talk about killing Daniel reminded me of something that I had read as gendered or problematic in Joe Cinque's Consolation, but in fact I think she probably did more broadly. I just didn't react badly to it. And that is her capacity to write really physical, sensual descriptions of people, which I found quite unnerving about her fixation on the women who'd been involved in the murder of Joe Cinque. That kind of focus on their physicality made me really uncomfortable, but she does actually do it with a lot of her characters, doesn't she? Or characters / real, real characters.
She does. Can I say at that point, in her archives, there's a lot of drafts of Joe Cinque, and at all those points, and you'd know this as once being her editor, at these points when she has said things like "my girl hackles are going up" about Anu Singh, all these different moments, her editor has written, "Helen, you're vulnerable here," and she's written in the edge, "Yep, don't care. Yep, okay." And I think that's really interesting because she did say, after I was sort of exorcised...
Who was her editor on Joe Cinque?
Judith Lucan Amundsen. And she said, after the first stone and the attacks that came upon me, I developed scar tissue. And she thought, I can't get any lower than this of what people have said about me and whatever. I can do whatever I like, I'm free. And so that is one of the moments where I thought that's quite obvious that she was a stronger person at that point, saying, I'm prepared to wear it. Some of them is, yes, I know, and I'm prepared to wear it. And almost invariably every moment where she has written that has been a moment where the critics have said, this is outrageous. And I think, so it's interesting to see it's a very conscious decision on her part.
I think her writing became much more conscious. Or maybe it's always been more conscious than I've given it credit for. I'm not quite sure.
Well, that's the thrill that I've had. I've been a pretty lucky person because I've actually got to see all her process journals of while she was doing the first stone and Joe Cinque's Consolation and this House of Grief. So I've actually been inside her sort of working mind every day of those 7 years for this House of Grief and all those sort of files. And what you get to see is the extent with which she throws herself in and crafts her work.
Yes, the crafting is so...
The crafting is extraordinary. I became a better writer just by
reading her.
By seeing how she works.
I think she's sort of, on one, she's an inspiration in that at 75, her writing is still evolving. And the piece that she wrote about the woman in the Monthly, have you read that, Sophie?
Why She Broke. It's the first one in the
yes, I have.
large one.
And I mean that's a piece that is just so taut and so terrifically well built, but it's also what sympathy she summons in that situation. So perhaps some of that her thinking has evolved as well on those.
I think I'm not breaking a confidence here when I can say that when she was writing that essay, she said, all my feminist girl hackles have raised up in a fury just because of what that mother had been through and what she was continually subjected to, and her cultural need to continue to have children and to avoid at all costs to have a hysterectomy when she could possibly have died. And Helen was deeply affected by that, very deeply, precisely because this was about a woman and her body and this was not okay. So...
I just, one of the reasons I actually raised the issue about the need to appease the father figure earlier was because it does directly relate to her non-fiction versus her fiction, in that she started to focus on non-fiction for many years because her third husband, or because Murray Bale, and I think she talks about this in her essays. I don't think I'm saying anything out of school, that he felt that she was better at non-fiction and that fiction was it was a territory he'd carved out, and it was one of the ways they managed their relationship as two writers living together, and she sort of ceded that space. I know what she's regretted or says that she regretted doing. I don't know if there was any particular novel she would have written during that phase that she didn't. But the power struggle has really affected the form her work has taken at times, I think.
Very much so. Although people who were friends of theirs at the time said in those early years they were just the most extraordinary couple to be around. They were so vibrant, so brilliant, so exciting. So there was great, and she says there was great joy, and I learnt to be still, and I learnt to immerse myself in deeper readings and deeper works, all thanks to Murray Bale. But then when things went wrong, then it was really chaotic, because the fishbowl of Australian writing, I think, wasn't quite big enough. And there you had these two major writers in conflict. So it was an issue, a big issue. Yeah.
She writes, you write about that well, actually, in your, because I had always, I hadn't quite understood what had been so vibrant about that marriage until I read your book. In fact, I'd been more aware of the pitfalls, but you managed to express the kind of intellectual kind of quality of her intellectual life improving in many ways, or her sense that it improved, and she was with someone. I think it's in actually The Art of the Dumb Question. She talks about being in a group household and waking up or having sex with someone, then saying something like, let's talk about good and evil, or light and dark.
Isn't that great? The boyfriend's
and he's
sick.
like, oh, really? And do we have to? Oh, and
Yeah.
you know, so she actually really wanted a partner who was prepared to kind of move from the kind of the physical to the intellectual like that.
And it comes back to what you're saying about the self-deprecating attitude, that I think it is true, that I think she is riven with self-doubt, and the writer's self-doubt. Is this any good? Can I get this right? But at the same time, she knows how good she is, and she's really, really smart, and she's really, really clever and quick. And so I think that is a disjunct, and I think probably being with Murray Bale would have been intellectually extremely stimulating for both of them. And I mean, she brought to that relationship her pop culture, her sort of funky dancing, her
she used
sort
to
of
work
wild
actually
woman stuff.
in a pop for various rock and roll magazines and stuff, didn't she? When she was younger, and she was also involved with playwriting at La Mama and those. So she's had a really broad career.
Yeah, she was a songwriter. Yeah, so
which I didn't know. Who did she write for? I mean,
well, she just wrote the songs, and then they were performed by various bands. Stiletto was one of the big name bands around Melbourne, and the idea being that it was probably this unique idea because Melbourne is so cool with its bars and its underground music scene back in the 70s, and she's then writing, the late 70s, she's writing for these bands, and they're performing them because they're all living in the same household. So she walks out of her bedroom and says, anyone, what do you think of this? And Andrew Bell picks up his guitar and they start practice. Oh, here's our song. So and then they recorded them. So another huge phase of her life that a lot of people didn't know about.
Chloe, I wanted to ask you a bit the notion of detachment, which Helen actually writes very well. She writes about very well in most of her work, but there's a piece about going to the morgue. In fact, she talks about how cheery it was going to the morgue,
I love that detail.
Got sick of sitting at her desk alone all day, and she'd chat to the morgue workers, and they'd all have a coffee
moment.
together.
I've underlined it. It's for those who haven't read it. It's just anyway. But sorry.
Did she? Because you write fairly extraordinary non-fiction dealing with, well, any extraordinary fiction, non-fiction, I think deals with confronting material, and you do that extraordinarily well. Did you learn specifically from Helen?
Well, thank you. I think I certainly feel that I was very much influenced by her, and I wondered to myself whether or not Australians would read about an Aboriginal man who had died and his family's quest to have justice for him, and sort of wondered what I could in some way steal from Joe Cinque's Consolation and apply it to The Tall Man. That was in my mind that book had been a big hit, and I wondered whether or not you know, people would read about more perhaps politically charged material. I really, that the detail of going to the morgue and finding yourself feeling sort of happy,
But not telling your friends about it afterwards.
that's a very, that's just such a Helen Garner moment for me. And I think maybe I share with her a, you know, an interest in why do people do things that seem unthinkable and unspeakable, and I'm probably interested as she is in looking at certain things others might recoil from, and that's probably, you know, I can't calculate how, you know, how much of that is inherited.
Can I just say one thing about that one? When she does the details, that she's saying they take the skull and they're scrubbing out the inside of the skull, but it's in the way that my grandmother used a way. So it's these gentle, commonplace ways of saying, I'm actually asking you to look at something which is probably pretty confronting for most people, but I'm going to couch it in language that is very understandable and, in a sense, approachable. It's extraordinary.
And it's I think it's one of the qualities of her work that people both love and are challenged by. So I interviewed her at a couple of writers' festivals about House of Grief, and a few people you could tell were very distressed by that, even though in fact that's not actually a very detached book in some ways. She was very traumatised, and she writes about that, but her capacity to kind of write with some detachment on the subject of the death of the children, people found challenging. But then with The Spare Room, I think people just felt such a huge sense of relief that she managed to convey the frustration you can feel when someone's making life and death choices that you think are the wrong ones and have no capacity to control them, I think. And she actually writes about that somewhere, that people kept telling her that The Spare Room was a bit monstrous in some ways, but that had never been her experience. That people didn't actually really think that. Reviewers might have said that, but in fact people just constantly come up to her and said, thank God, thank you for saying that.
I think this is something that happens all the time with Helen's nonfiction. And so I've had a lot of people say to me, that Spare Room, and they're so angry because Helen, the character, and Helen Garner is writing this character of anger, and that's just so outrageous. But as you say, one after the other, these groups she addressed said, thank you. Nobody else in this room is angry. Or we are angry, but they were not angry with you because we thank you for naming our frustration. So again, it's that passionate response to her writing. And
she has a great capacity for the zeitgeist, really. So the first stone was written about when these things weren't quite in the air the way they are now, and indeed the role of what it's like to be a carer is clearly very increasingly pressing, and she wrote The Spare Room.
I don't think I could go as... I would find it very hard to write about people... small children is sort of me. I can't go there, but I'm glad that I'm grateful to her for taking me there.
But maybe you couldn't 30 years.
Maybe.
What I mean is she was sort of...
Maybe.
She had an adult daughter by then.
Yes, and that she brings her grandsons into it. So, you know, that's that sort of distance that maybe,
It's now time for questions. Do people have questions? I'm not going to pick the people are going to come to you with a microphone, and I'm just going to sit and wait. I can't see, sorry. No, they're quite bright lights.
In the dumb question, she notes her she was disappointed when she reread Joan Didion's Slouching Towards Bethlehem. And that surprised me because in the nonfiction, I would have tended to compare the two.
Yes, I actually had that response also, even though I know that people do get very critical of Didion's composure, which is something that I suppose that Helen gets criticised for. What do you think about did she talk to you at all about Didion?
Not about Didion. No, we talked much more about Janet Malcolm and other writers. But no, we didn't talk about Didion.
But certainly Helen is more giving of herself, I think, than Didion is. So maybe that's one of the things she's reacting to. And she actually specifically says that Didion's over-stylised. And I do think there's an artlessness to Helen, her use of colloquial language and those kind of things which relax it in some way.
I think that's where she was moving to, so that Didion was too, in a sense, well, stylised is the perfect word, but formal, you know, perfectly structured there, whereas Helen by this stage is moving more towards the Janet Malcolm, more towards the, who's also a bit more detached and cold in a lot of ways, but is that more, as you say, colloquial, approachable, conversational voice maybe?
Yeah, there's actually a documentary about Joan Didion out at the moment, just apropos of not much. Yes.
Hi there. I'd love to hear your reflections on Helen's perception of crime and the police. As someone who has a huge body of work, and I'd say in her early days had a bit of ambivalence, maybe even anger or resistance towards the justice system, police and so forth, but then has gone on to write so much non-fiction based on crime. What do you think in terms of her? I see a pretty strong shift in her perception there, and I'd be interested to know what you thought.
I'm just going to leap in and say that she practically writes a love letter to the cops in House of Grief. She's just totally enamoured of them, but I'll let other people answer in more detail, I think.
I have to admit that I haven't read House of Grief. So.
Okay, well, she's yes, it is a love letter to those detectives, the Special Investigations Unit, and she has massive admiration for the detectives that she's come across in the last two big books. I know Harry Haynes was the detective in the Joe Cinque case, and she formed a very intense relationship with him, and he married another police officer. They had children, and there's lots and lots of letters to and fro between them about their kids and about their life, and she came to be very close to a number of the investigating officers in both of those cases.
I remember Gabrielle Lord, who worked quite closely with police when she was writing thrillers. She actually ended up ending up marrying one of the cops. She was, I think policemen are police are really nerdy, which is something that Helen loves. Like, they're really into detail.
They're into detail. They're strong. They don't show their emotions too much. The ones that she writes a lot about, the Sarah Kasky, who's the diving detective, the diving unit woman, and with great respect. But the men who are doing this case, she likes their strength, she likes their humanity. In the Joe Cinque case, she loved the way the detective was protective of the Cinque family. She saw that as something that empathy she really responded to. So
they're also doing this work professionally, which is what she does, looking at.
she says she's jealous of them.
Why has this happened?
Why and the sort of the really mucky details of it.
Even though, as you in the first Stone, one of her frustrations with the women is that there's some phrase, isn't there, like, you don't run to the cops.
They go to the cops, yeah.
So there's a certain contempt, but maybe that's the contempt is for going to the cops over something that is not serious in her view. But I think she's always liked the police. I don't think she's ever been quite as anti-establishment as...
She's not, I don't think she's very anti-establishment. I think she is very much the head girl from the Hermitage. But
that's harsh.
But I mean that in the nicest kind of way, in that she is quite a conservative person, but she has led a full life, and she does not... I'm about to say something that sounds completely paradoxical. I was about to say she doesn't judge people, and yet in her writing she's often asking you to look into these people. But she doesn't actually come down, I don't think, with the sort of moral high ground about people's lives or what they do. She just wants to understand people. But I think she herself is quite a conservative person.
And she's actually very critical of other professionals, and Joe Cinque is critical of the legal profession in particular.
Yeah, although she really admires them too. She loves a good barrister.
Okay, do we have more questions in the...
Miss Cunningham, when you said you edited Cosmolino, did like Helen wince when you cut bits and things like that?
No, I mean, the thing is, she's such a good writer. She's not the kind of writer where you're kind of rewriting sentences, really. It was more the kind of editing where you might point out a plot hole or say... In fact, the lengthiest conversation was about one of the characters put the washing out and then left it out for 3 weeks, and we had an argument about that. I can't remember the details. It affected the timeline of the story. I can remember it thinking that I'd kind of managed to come up with something to really, to really challenge her on. But in terms of, because when it comes to style, she has extremely strong sense, I think, of what she wants. So the conversations weren't about style. The conversations were about whether...
She's a major stylist.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
The conversations were more about character motivations, and so it was more a conversation to help fill out the plot. I liked the novel very much, but I think it was considered to be her least successful novel. I think in part because she's trying to think through her relationship to spirituality, and people were a bit uncomfortable with that, I suspect.
Definitely, yeah. I didn't like that novel when it first came out, and I think I might have been an undergraduate at that point, and thought, I think I'd probably put it up there as my favourite of her works now. It was fantastic to immerse myself in that work and the surrounding work that she was thinking about at the time. I put it right up there with Cosmo.
But in general, I mean, and Chloe has alluded to this, Helen's incredibly... she can be very irritable, but she's also incredibly generous. So she calls a spade, but she's very generous with her time. She's very generous with people who either offer opinions or ask for advice or those kind of things.
Yeah, that's right.
I was interested in how we started the discussion talking about feminism and age. So I'll say I'm 66, and I was in the first intake of women going into Ormond, and when I read Helen's book, I thought it was spot on, describing the nature of the institution and issues not just about feminism but also about class and economic privilege. But I do wonder, I should read it again because a lot's changed and my ideas about a lot of things have changed. But I mean, I'm just sort of interested to sort of explore this thing, to me the key issue was, this issue of proportionality was huge. I mean, it might be that women of our, and I'm a bit younger, but not much from Helen, that we were very much in male enclaves. I mean, in Ormond, I think there were 50 women and 200 men, or 150, I can't remember the numbers, but, stepping overpoweringly into a male institution, as we had to in a lot of other things. And, perhaps that sort of formed a different attitude, and why sort of attitudes to sort of feminism have changed over time. So I just wonder if you have any comments on that.
I definitely agree that that feminism is generational and writing is generational, and I also I don't even know that Helen says it, because sometimes I get confused by my memory of what's in the book and what happened in the debate, but the issue really wasn't that the women were saying what happened to them was the worst thing in the world. It was that they couldn't get anyone to take them seriously, and they just wanted to be able to make a complaint, and then when no one could be bothered dealing or being interested in the complaint, then it escalated. So it was really their silencing that caused the drama.
Also, I guess
I
don't know how many generations of, or for how long women had been residents at Ormond College, but it's...
When was the first intake?
1970, wasn't it?
73, right.
Okay, so this is 20 years later. I mean, it's just not cool to go and have the head of that institution. If you're a young man, I don't know, you're talking to him about your degree or whatever, and you go into his office and that's what you're discussing, and you're a young woman, and at a dance or wherever else, he puts his hand on your breast or up your skirt. I mean, that is
Allegedly. Allegedly.
But
well,
but she does write. I don't. There's things I really admire about the book, not really the gender politics, but the stuff about class I think is really interesting.
But I guess the class and the sort of gender politics go together.
Yes,
What sort of these entitled young men versus often entitled young women were sort of what they were learning about what their place in the world and what they could expect and how they could expect to be treated. I have great respect for Helen's point of view and for the sort of feminists who've come before me, but I think it's just completely inappropriate that, and although completely common, that this goes on.
I'll just add one last thing, which is really interesting. The letters that were written to Helen after the first stone, not nearly all of them, but a huge number of them, and there was 500 or so in her files, began with, I am a woman and I am 66 years of age. I am a woman and I'm 72 years of age. I am a woman and I'm 24 years of age. So it's very interesting that you began like that. And that was part of the other aspect of the debate, which was not necessarily about what happened at Ormond, but about women and passivity generally, and women being polite and not standing up to power, which was another tangent that Helen wanted to explore, and it certainly was picked up by a lot of the readers who wrote to her. But what was interesting was that every one of them would begin with their age, with usually their marital status, and whether they were a grandmother or not, or those sorts of things, which I thought was very interesting.
There is so much more that we could say, but I've got a red light flashing at me, so unfortunately we're done. I really would like to thank my co-panellists, Chloe Hooper and Bernadette Brennan.
Thanks, Sophie. Thank you.
Sophie.
Thanks for coming.
And of course, pay my hello, Helen, if you're there. I hope you enjoyed it. It'd be a very weird situation, a bit weird experience, I think, to listen to people talking about your work in the way we have tonight. Copies of the text, the new textbooks, True Stories, which is the non-fiction, and what's the fiction collection called? Real Stories? Stories are for sale, as well as some of her backlist, I believe, and Bernadette's book is also for sale. Thank you.